The famous photographer Ted Allan in his studio in Hollywood, California. Ted, tell me just enough about your own personal background so that we get a sense of what turned you into what you became. Where were you born?
Well, I guess it all starts at that point where you were born. I was born in Arizona in a mining town, and like depicted in the last picture show, we had a little movie theater, and I lived there until I was about 11. Intrigued by movies, of course, as all kids were. But that was broken into by my father getting sick, and I had to move with my uncle out on a ranch in New Mexico, which cut into it about 3 years. But eventually I wound up with my mother after my father died in Long Beach, California. And it just so happened about 5 blocks from where I lived with my aunt was a deserted original motion picture studio. So help me, I don't know the name of it. But it stood there and covered about a half a block. And it was deserted and closed up, boarded up. The scenery was still there. The sets, some sets were standing. And on the way to the beach to go swimming every other day or so, I would drop into this little studio and just sit there. And it seems as though the ghosts would come in from all around. And there even were some old-fashioned lights that they used.
How old were you?
At this point, I'm about 12 or 13. So, if we want to skip through a lot of the uninteresting part, I call it, I arrived at a point where I thought I was an artist, and evidently a few other people thought I could do sketching and drawing and painting. Naturally, no training. And I got a job in my teens as in an art department that did lobby displays. It was called the Art Guild, and we did displays for all the big downtown Neapolitan theaters in Los Angeles. And the lobbies for the big theaters were all custom done at that point. They consisted of oil paintings, tempera work, line sketches, caricatures, whatever the picture called for, we were called upon to deliver. And I became as a pot cleaner and brush washer, and they allowed me to do a few ads because I was pretty good at Higgins with the Higgins ink. And went from there into doing oil portraits and tempera and quite a few pastels. And I like that because I could kind of blend everything in with my thumb and make it look more photographic than some of the other art. Then along came a chap to town who was threatening the business that I was working in. He was a photographer, so-called. He would take the stills from the movie, copy them, and make life-size blow-ups. Well, he could do a whole lobby display overnight that way. So he was cutting into our business. He was a threat to the business. He would blow up these pictures. They would put a little flesh color on them and put a little tone in the background. And they looked pretty much like artwork when he got through with them. But it was a shortcut that we didn't have. So I'm at this point about 17. And the boss said, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut down on our staff because of this inroads of the photographic type lobby. So I said, oh, I see the reason is, he's going to take over, I presume. I said, I do that sort of thing, this brash 17-year-old. And they evidently believed me because the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks they spent putting a complete dark room in the basement. Well, when it came time to deliver, my knees were knocking, and I had to deliver. I called Eastman Kodak, and I called Ansco, and I lowered my voice a bit and said, I'm now opening a photo department for the Art Guild, and would like to have someone come over and demonstrate the chemicals. I don't know whether I'm going to use Eastman or what. So Eastman sent this wonderful guy over. He was with me for 5 or 6 years.
Oh, I love it.
In and out of Eastman, buying things from him. But he came over, brought the chemicals, and brought the type of paper that he thought I would need for the big blow-ups. And he mixed the chemicals for me, and I followed, and he left me the formula. And he made my first test for me. I'll never forget it. It was a picture of Sally Eilers and James Dunn, ancient. I think Sally Eilers is still around. Mm-hmm. It was called Bad Girl. And, of course, my first photographic print was kind of unforgettable because it wasn't 8 by 10 inches, it was 8 by 10 feet. So my first photographic
Remember
print
the year?
was before the crash, so, 17, so it was a couple of years before the crash. We still had that to look forward to. But at any rate, here was this picture on the marquee of the big theater downtown that's no longer in existence, and one of the theater isn't in existence either. The Paramount Theater's been destroyed. It's now a parking lot. But this photograph stuck up there on the marquee for as long as the run of the picture. They didn't run very long in those days. Most of the theaters changed them every week, but this was a kind of a specialty theater. They held them for about 3 or 4 weeks, so I was able to view my handiwork for that long period of time very proudly. So it saved the business for this company, and also it saved my neck, as I didn't get fired, and they were very happy that I had this knowledge, which I did a lot of bluffing on. But when I used the camera to copy the stills to make the blow-ups of the movie stars, I realized that most of the stills I was copying were very flat and very uninteresting, and it kind of irked me that I would have to take a flat still and sometimes make it even flatter by copying it, So my main objective photographically, when I finally got into doing portraits, was to try to get a third dimension as possible. That would be basic. Somebody said, what do you try to achieve in photography? I would say with a flat two-dimensional picture, I try to give it stages of lighting, the background and the foreground and the backlighting, so that it gives it as much of a third dimension as possible. So that kind of made my work unique to begin with. The art knowledge helps in the retouching, to do just enough retouching to kill dissipation but not kill character, So that when I aimed my camera at all the artists there that worked at the Guild and did portraits of them and their families and my own family and my wife, why, I tried to light it in a certain way. Fortunately, later on, when I was shooting some stage actors at the El Capitan Theater, which it was called in those days, now it's the Henry Fonda Theater at this point. It's been through about 4 names. Yeah. They gave me 4 little spotlights to use. And I don't know whether I insisted on accepting spotlights rather than floodlights. I still think back. Being an artist, I did feel that I could paint with light, so to speak, and that in order to do that, you had to control the light. And if you used a floodlight like most of the photographers were doing, they were using skylights, and they were using the huge sort of a fluorescent light in those days. It was a purple light that made people look hideous. They were using all these non-controllable lights, which comes to a point when I did open a little studio on Hollywood Boulevard later. All the old-time photographers used to come by and look at my pictures in the display case and say, hey, what kind of paper are you using? How do you, those deep shadows? I said, well, it's kind of a special paper, and then I treat it with chemicals, and I achieve that, with mostly with Eastman paper, but it's the way I treat it. And I kept them thinking that that was the way it was done. I don't know how long because eventually everyone started using Theos spotlights in their photography. But in this way, I even put snoots on the light, we called them. I took little coffee cans or little soup cans and put them so they'd fit on the light, so it would control the arc, control the light spread. So I could just throw a light on the person's eyes, I could throw it across the face, Or if it was a buxom gal, you'd throw it across the thoracic development, and in that way you'd give it a more voluptuous and more three-dimensional look. And then you'd light the background separately, and you could light it hotter or colder or darker, so that the person stood away from the background at least. And then the backlight on the people also cut them away from the background. So I noticed that in movies, when they shot scenes, they threw light on the bottom part of the set and let the top part kind of go dark. And that impressed me because that allowed the backlight on light hair or blonde hair or anybody to cut them away from the background and also keep from throwing shadows on the background of the people. So I always avoid, any connection with the foreground person to the background as much as possible. Keep them in separation as much. You didn't ask me about my technique, but that happened to be
that's
the basic...
exactly what I want.
Yeah. That was the basic reason for my photography at the time being different from the usual. To me, it was just a natural thing because I'd been doing it off and on for about 4 or 5 years. I took an elaborate sitting of my wife in all kinds of poses and costumes and improvisations, and she took them around and put them on displays. She put them in the bank window across the street, and the library was a nice place, so they had these pictures all around the library. And this caused a chap named Otto Dyer at Fox to be walking down the boulevard one day and see the pictures, and dropped in to see me, and we formed a friendship. And so one day when he needed a still photographer at Fox, I was kind of cross between doing my studio and working for the WPA in those days. Sure. You had to have a few bucks because even the actors didn't have any money. So I was building, we were building the road up along Mulholland Drive, I'll never forget it, and filling in the pass over here where they now have a freeway. And this friend came over and said, Otto Dyer is calling from Fox. And so I jumped out of the mud, got home, took a shower, put on my one pair of flannels, white flannels. And so he jumped in the car and he drove me to the studio, and I worked until the finish of the picture at Fox. So after the picture was finished, I'd had a little taste of working on a movie set. And of course, from then on, you're through. I mean, you're starstruck or whatever it is, and nothing else will work.
Who were the stars in that first movie?
That was a Charlie Chan picture. I'll never forget it. I love those Mysterios.
That was when Warner Roland was playing.
Warner Roland, yeah. And
was Anna Mae Wong in it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
They only had 2 weeks to go, and the picture finished, and I didn't wait for Otto to give me another call. I got right in the little jalopy, a little Model T I had, and sailed out to the closest place, which happened to be Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. A few curves around in there from Fox Studios. They'd moved from Western Avenue out to their present location. So I went over into the camera department, and I said, I've been working at Fox, and they didn't ask me how long or how much I knew or anything. It just happened to hit.
Sure.
They needed a photographer to work on the Tarzan picture. So, and when I was at Fox, I'd shot some pictures of Will, what's his name? Turling the Twice.
Rogers?
Will Rogers, which he wouldn't sit for anybody. But I had my Graflex, my handy Graflex, and managed to capture a couple of shots, and that impressed everybody that I photographed Will Rogers, and was able to freeze him in action for a few seconds. So they needed someone for an action picture, and the Tarzan picture swinging through the trees and carrying Marino Sullivan in his arms while he's doing it. It called for a young guy who could get out in the weeds and in the jungle and do that. So that was one of my first pictures at Metro doing that. Now, when I was photographing Marino Sullivan, of course, she was in her Tarzan outfit, which I understand the second picture they covered up her a little more, but she just had a little G-string on, and so did Johnny Weissmuller, and it was great until somebody complained that it was a little too sexy, so then they put a whole skirt on her, which was disappointing. I'm glad I didn't work on the second one. In the meantime, I was working on some of those girly pictures. One of them was Student Tour, which I was shooting stills on, and I think that was Betty Grable's first picture. She had a little role in it. They hadn't discovered her really at that point. But all the little gals from Metro, all the little contract gals were in this picture called Student Tour. So here's a kid photographing kids, so to speak, a teenager practically shooting teenagers, which seems to fit into their idea of things pretty much. The Maureen O'Sullivan thing, there was one scene where she had on a silver lame evening gown. There was some gag in the picture where she's primping and putting this on. I don't know, they discovered it in an old trunk someplace in the jungle. And Johnny doesn't like it very much, Weissmuller. And they have a little scuffle in the trees. And he grabs at her, and she jumps out of the tree, and as a consequence, flies out of the dress and goes to this beautiful nude underwater sequence, which I guess maybe that upset during that period, that upset somebody a little bit, and that's why they clothed her a little better. But having this dress in the wardrobe and on the set, I sold Maureen O'Sullivan on the idea of the back lot. There was one stage near the back lot, near the jungles place where we were shooting other than shooting up north in actually the big jungle that is now real estate development. We went up and shot most of the stuff exterior. And, pardon me a second. Hello. Oh, now it's going in. Well, to make a long story short, we were shooting in the studio, in the jungle compound that was on the back lot. But next to the back lot was this soundstage with some beautiful columns, which I love anyway, as you can see by some of the pictures. So I sold her on the idea of going in and doing some glamorous stuff, and a little bit different from the jungle stuff that she'd been doing with a chimp. So Howard Strickling, I showed Howard Strickling the portraits, pardon me, that I'd done of Maureen, and then in the meantime later I did some portraits of these young gals in a student tour film, and mounted them up beautifully and took them up to the head of publicity. Howard Strickling, who was in charge then, I think went through about a dozen different regimes there, and
he had a long career
until he retired finally. Now, he could tell some stories, couldn't he?
Not bad.
Yeah. Anyway, pardon me. Oh boy. Howard says, "So you do this sort of thing?" I said, "Well, yeah, because portraits to me, that was photography.
Sure.
Stills I love doing because of the contact with the people and using your ingenuity to get them to stop production while you set up and took stills, you know. If you had a few jokes to tell and you were charming enough and made them lose sight that they were losing time every time you set up and took 10 minutes or 15 minutes, the more you could do that and the better you were, the more you were sought after with work. But when he said, "Do you do that sort of thing?" it kind of amazed me because I didn't separate the two. Photography was photography and portraits were... And he said, "Well, we'll have to give you a shot at the gallery." So I didn't know what they had in mind at the time, but Clarence Bull had a gallery, and there was a smaller gallery that the transient photographers and special photographers and magazine photographers would come in and use. So they turned that little gallery over to me and had me shoot portraits of all the contract people. And I guess they're feeling their way to see if I could do it. But really what they had in mind was, one day they came to me and they said, Jean Harlow is looking for a special photographer, and we'd like you to audition using, I said, audition? I thought actors audition. They said, no, we've got 3 photographers who we're going to try out. A guy named Ball, and Russell Ball, and Tommy Evans, who's Madge Evans' brother, who's doing photography, and you. So you're going to be competing, so we might as well tell you that. And I said, that's fine. I was younger and had a little more, I guess, charm and personality than the older guy, who was a very sweet guy, but he'd been in the business for 40 years and still was a little old-fashioned. And Tommy didn't have the experience. He was artistic enough. Some of his work was very good. But I made it a point to find out a few things about Miss Harlow before I photographed her. I found out that she wore very few underthings, and as a result, when she went in the dressing room, she'd practically come out immediately. She'd throw on the dress and the shoes, and if it was a hat, the hat. And that's all she had to worry about. Because as a matter of fact, I think when she had gotten a little row with L.B. Mayer one day about salaries, as it usually was the problem, she said, look, if I don't get a raise, she said, I'm going to start wearing a brassiere, you know what I mean? So I think she got the raise. But at any rate, she wore just the outer garments, and of course had the body to do that. And so I said, of course, I want to have a stage or else use the big gallery, and so they let me have the big gallery, and sent Clarence Sinclair Bull home, I guess, for the afternoon. But I had a setup in the 4 corners of the gallery. I had lights all set and a background. One I had a pier background, I'll never forget, with a big fishnet hanging over the end of the pier, and one was a very classic kind of Baroque plaster thing that was photographed very well. And whatever else. Pardon me. God, when I'm talking like that, I get that tickle in the throat. Anyway, I was ready for her when she got out of the dressing room. And
you had made 4 different setups? 4
different setups, and all I had to do was turn my camera and hit a light. All the lights were on, and the key light.
One was a pier. What were the other 3?
One was this Baroque thing with mirrors and stuff. And one had a few columns in, and this plaster thing, you see there.
I see.
And a couple of gobos on either side, black gobos, and just that panel in the center. So when she dressed, that dress was just, I was trying to shoot light through it, but it was so thick you couldn't, but it still gave a nice indication of her body as you can see it. The fluted skirt was just beautiful. You could just spread that all out. I got some with her sitting with this all spread out in a circle. And so all she had to do was stand there and smile, and boom, and she thought, is that it? I said, when she said that it, that was a compliment to me, because ordinarily she would say that's enough, you know?
Exactly.
Anyway, I shot more, and I shot better, and I got the job. So the audition turned out pretty good.
What did it mean, really? What did the success mean?
It meant that a big star was going to be asking for my services. So that meant either a steady job or an increase in salary or just a fulfillment of whatever artistic ideas I had. Because like later on when I worked with Frank Sinatra, all I would say is Frank wants it. And at this point, I would say Harlow needs this or Harlow needs that. And she was...
Did that mean that you worked exclusively for her?
That meant that whenever she had to have or wanted a sitting,
you dropped everything.
I dropped everything.
Right.
The rest of the people were, people like John Barrymore and Bob Taylor and all those people that you've seen photographed were William Powell and so forth, were kind of second to her because she was the one, you see, and that was the important thing. That was the ego builder.
She knew it.
She owned you. She had me and she owned me, which was a nice feeling, you know. Others tried it. I mean, Eleanor Powell wanted to have me exclusively. but she wasn't a big enough star. And her mother was always with her, funny to see her, always kind of chaperoning. So whenever she'd get away from her, she would come over to the studio and I'd shoot a few pictures if I wasn't shooting Jean Harlow. As a matter of fact, one day she said, let's get married. And I thought, my God, is she kidding? And actually she wasn't kidding.
You were a devil.
Well, I said to her, I don't think my wife would understand. That's how much I thought she was kidding. I never saw her again for 30 years. And she called me one day and said, my children don't know who I am or what I've done. They see me occasionally on television. But she said, I'm going back and do a little show. I'm going to do Vegas. Would you please do a sitting of me? I said, would I please do a sitting of me? Of course. Now we'll do it in color nowadays.
What a great compliment.
Oh, yeah. God, I was so flattered, And so that just shows how the stars wanted to have you exclusively. Harlow, of course, she owned her hairdressers. She owned the makeup man. Everybody that pleased her was hers, So, and I was very happy with that because it allowed me to do work in the gallery and be chosen by a few other people, Norma Shearer. And, of course, John Barrymore was a character. You didn't have to entertain him when you were photographing. Ordinarily a photographer has to kind of keep him feeling unconscious, unself-conscious, because the bigger star they are, the more awkward they... Spencer Tracy felt like a fool in front of the still camera.
Really?
The way he showed that was his dislike for the whole idea. And he'd get out of there as soon as he could. I'd have to get him in 15-minute sessions rather than an all-afternoon session. Like Robert Taylor would be there for all day long, changing into whatever clothes I picked for him to make him look rough and tumble. So that Tracy would just say, that's it, I'll see you later. And I said, well, I need a couple more, so he'd give you a couple more. He says, all I have to do really is make a movie, do a performance. That's my job. These pictures,
Mm-hmm.
But he did them, but it was under protest. And John Barrymore came in and would tell story after story of his experiences, and they're just a fascinating guy. And he'd sit there as long, and you'd have an occasional drink with him. Oh, Harlow, incidentally, would bring 2 bottles of gin. It wasn't vodka in those days, it was gin, And she liked to
nibble a bit,
snort. I'd take 1 drink out of those 2 bottles, and those 2 bottles were finished by the end of the day. And you wouldn't know it. Of course, she had the limousine there to drive her around 3 blocks, or whatever it was. It wasn't actually 3 blocks. There's 3 sound stages away to her dressing room. And this car would wait there for her all day. And she'd crawl in with her maid, a colored maid, wonderful gal, that I called one day when Jean was in the hospital, and I called to find out how Jean was. And the maid evidently was just cleaning out the room in the hospital and was there and answered the phone and said, Jean's dead. What a shocker.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I can remember where I was when her death was announced, and I burst into tears. I mean, it's the only time that's ever happened to me.
Isn't that right? I burst into tears when she hit that mountain, Carol Lombard. Because she was the charmer. What a gal. Mm-hmm. Those 4-letter words out of this baby face.
Yes.
It was just fascinating.
Yes.
First time I ever heard a movie star use 4-letter words of that sort, the Anglo-Saxon 4 letters, and she made them sound like regular dialogue, And, of course, she and Gable were so much in love. So much. She would stop everything and go on a fishing trip with him. Where Jean Harlow told me once, she said, look, I think that I had a little brochure I made out, you'll have to take a look at it, that had some things that Harlow had to say about her leading men. You didn't ever see that?
No, I'd love to see it.
And I always said Gable. She said, yeah, I think that fishing and hunting isn't my thing. She said, I think sometimes Gable wants me more as a buddy than a body, you know. So that made me start thinking about what she said about Bob Taylor, Francois Tone, and Cary Grant. So I just took some of my pictures and made them a little brochure of what Jean Harlow thought about her leading men, you know. But that was, of course...
Was Taylor a problem to photograph? To me, he was always so pretty.
Well, he came to me one day and he said, hey, you know, when I first photographed him, and said, what about this bump on my nose here? Kind of a Roman nose, you know? And I said, he said, do you think I should have anything done? I said, my God, I said, look at Johnny Weissmuller's nose. It looks photographs well, but up close, Johnny Weissmuller's nose is a mess from the standpoint of a surgeon's scalpel. A photograph's great, and it gives a great impression, but I said, they can butcher you, you know, and I said, besides that, you'd be more beautiful than your leading ladies. So he dropped the idea and still had that nose, but the widow's peak was what made him look, came down real sharp, and his hair was glistening and healthy looking, and he had the pink. Just after he shaved, it was so beautiful, you know, so good looking. When he started growing a beard, I took a few shots of him that way to give him a little virility, and I would put him in sweatshirts, and I had some old kind of ragged things that I had, some T-shirts and that sort of thing that I told him to put on, and scarves, and he'd do it. He says, I want to, you know, look like a He-Man. And I said, well, anyway, we can... Harlow commented on that. She said we were shooting on the back lot one time, and I had the greatest urge to push him over on the grass and mess him up when we were on the location shooting, you know. But he was no problem, because you could photograph him from any angle, you know. And Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was a great photographic face. There's one right on top over there. You see that one? He had a dynamic face then. But and of course Jimmy Stewart was a subject. I never took the jury. I never thought Jimmy Stewart would be the terrific actor. You know, John Barrymore was my idea of an actor. You know, or any of the for Tone I thought was pretty terrific. He kind of effete and all, and kind of New York theater type, but you know. Yeah. But I thought Jimmy Stewart was just a gawky kid that might do a few things and then be forgotten about. And he's the one who's lasted. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's John. He was great to photograph. The anyway, they're.
How long did the Harlow thing last for you? Because she didn't.
Oh, she died a year later.
Yeah.
So I went to work for Selznick at that point, and left MGM. And of course, I didn't know it at the time, but L.B. Mayer blackballed me from the lot because I went to work for Selznick. I got to work 2 days a week for Selznick and make 3 times as much money as I was making Metro. And I thought, there's a son-in-law, so why not, you know? But I guess it was the abruptness. Selznick started making movies right away on his own studio. And I did about 5 pictures for him, special photography on them. A Star is Born, Nothing Sacred, and just before he made the big one, I always had a habit of leaving someplace just before all hell broke loose. He did Gone with the Wind after I left and went to Columbia Broadcasting to be head of their photo department. But I had a chance to do Ronald Coleman and people like that when I went over with Selznick. and Joe Cotton and some of those people that were just new in the beginning. And so I didn't know till I went back to MGM to do a little job. 15 minutes later, somebody said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, yeah, LB is dead now, so I guess it's all right for you to be here." And I said, "Are you kidding?" And he said, "No, I'm sort of kidding," but he said he was pretty mad at you for a long time.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. LB had a habit of screwing people's lives up. Later on, I had a chance to work with Francis X. Bushman. You remember him?
Yes.
And when he was on radio, he was trying to make a living. When I was working for CBS, while he was doing a show, and he also had a hamburger stand down at the beach. Here's Masala. What's the guy's name in Ben-Hur? What part did he play?
Masala.
Masala or something like that. And all because of L.B. Mayer throwing a wrench in his career. Just screwed him up terribly. But it didn't bother me because I didn't even know about it, because I'd spent 9 of those years with Columbia Broadcasting in charge of their photography here in Hollywood. That's where I met DeMille. And DeMille thought I was pretty terrific, and I realized later, he told somebody, he said, I overheard him saying, "He makes me look less like an egg than other photographers." And I suddenly realized I use shadows a lot in my physics, see? With the spots that I spoke of, with the little snoots on them. I still do that. And so in some of the shots, it looks like he almost had a head of hair, But he gave me quite a bit of work after he left CBS. He was doing the Lux Radio Theatre. He said, it's a shame he lost that job, because it seems funny to say it's a shame that Cecil B. DeMille lost the job. But he told, I want to do Guy Bienenfeld. I don't know who he is. Anyway, so where were we? We were talking about.
We started talking about Cecil B. DeMille losing the job.
Oh yes. Well, let me get into DeMille. Did you see that shot up there of Samson and Delilah? First off, after I spent all the time at CBS, they hired me because they'd heard I'd photographed all these big movie stars. And at this point, in 1938, all the movie stars were crowding into radio. The Lux Theatre, Orson Welles was coming out. Frank Sinatra was going to come out here and do a 15-minute show every day or something like that. And so they heard that I was photographer to the stars and said, "Come on, we'll build a studio for you." So while I was waiting for them to build a penthouse studio for me at Columbia Square, they put me in this little theater where I started photography with Mrs. Leslie Carter and the Shanghai Gesture. They had a big roof garden at this theater, and they were just using it for broadcast purposes, so they didn't utilize all the things that legitimate theater usually does, with parties and garden parties and that sort of thing. So I had this whole roof for a couple of years while they're building the CBS building here, and that's where I used to. Then I used to broadcast the Lux Radio Theatre from there, and the Texaco Star Theatre, and every big show where they had
your job to photograph the stills on the
I had 2 cameramen to shoot the wild stuff and action stuff, which I felt for some reason that I would do it whenever a holiday came around and they wanted time off. But I did the portraits and they did the news stuff. Now all those pictures, I don't know where they are. I'd like to have some of the portraits that I did of Stokowski. They were beautiful with his flaring hair and his white tie and tails, and against these colored backgrounds. Lottie Lehman and all the people for Columbia Records. I did all their portraits, everything too. That was included in the job. Nelson Eddy, and I did him at Metro, but then I did him for Columbia Records. And who else? Bruno Volter, the conductor.
Of course.
And those were great shots because they were posed and they were a little thought behind them. But those, same way when I worked for for NBC, I did all their big stars after I left CBS. I just did it on a daily basis. Went in and shot the Jack Bennies and those people. All those negatives were just discarded. Can you believe that? And that's why the John Cabal, chap I was just talking to on the phone from New York, he ran across these negatives that you see right here. He said, I've got some negatives of yours. I'd like to have you make some prints. I understand you're still alive. I said, very much so, I think. And he said, we're going to put a big display in the Museum of Modern Art, and I'd like to have some of your pictures there, and I'm sending you negatives. Well, you imagine when I opened that envelope and the first negatives fell out on the desk, and here are these negatives of Harlow and Taylor of 50 years ago, and they still had my fingerprints on the negatives.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah. And I said, when I saw John, I said, there are my fingerprints. If you think that's not my negative, match the prints, Because I sat down as a teenager with those old retouchers. I've been retouching these pictures at Metro for 15 years and showed them how to retouch, and they really resented it. They didn't know of my background. They didn't know that I'd learned to etch a negative from this little Maltese character that taught me how to carefully shave the emulsion off of a negative so I could reduce the negative rather than scratching it, Mm-hmm. Whenever the studio retouchers would etch on a negative, which makes the shadow on the negative, the opposite of artwork, they would always have sort of scratches in it because the knife would catch in the emulsion, where it shouldn't, and scrape it. So all I had to do was sit down and show them that I knew how to do that, and then from then on they said, okay, you're okay. You can tell us whatever you want to tell us. They're your pictures. We'll do the other photographers the way we want to. We'll do yours the way you want it. So that worked out very well, and that's why my fingerprints happened to be on those negatives. And also they had my name on the side, which MGM is the only place that did that. All the negatives I did from then on, we never bothered to identify in that fashion. Even when I was in charge of the department, I never thought of putting my name on a negative. So those are long gone. Somebody has them maybe someplace, and maybe they've been destroyed. Like NBC just emptied a whole room to use it as an office. And it was full of all these beautiful 8x10 negatives, And they just said, toss them. And off they went. Okay. Now we're up to leaving CBS, and I went back to the movie business because I wanted to get my card as a cinematographer, which had been that was my motive all along. All these pictures you see on the wall that I'm appreciating, and a lot of people seem to be, were simply a means to an end. They were a starting point.
I should break in at this point and just indicate that the pictures that Mr. Allan is referring to are large blow-ups of, and I'm just going to go around the list, of Jean Harlow looking extraordinarily seductive and glamorous and attractive, Clark Gable, Anne Southern,
Right.
Spencer Tracy, Shirley Temple, Carol Lombard.
And the more recent one, the comedian,
Jerry
Lewis.
Jerry Lewis. It's a picture of Jerry Lewis that makes him look like a great dramatic actor. Isn't it? Like leading man. That's extraordinary. And that apparently that the original shots of Jean Harlow going back to that first shooting,
right? Yeah.
Where you were auditioning.
Yeah.
It's breathtaking. And then
and the one in back of you.
Oh, I hadn't turned around to see that. Oh, Groucho, of course, Groucho Marx. And then John Barrymore and Francho Tone and Douglas Fairbanks and Mickey Rooney, yes?
Yeah,
One of the people you photographed.
William Powell and Myrna Loy. All the rest, yeah. Well, those were done just to become a cinematographer or producer or director. And then, of course, when you've remained peripheral all these years, you figure, well, if somebody appreciated what you did 50 years ago, maybe it was all worth it. Mm-hmm. But all the stuff that you see, except more recent things, and the DeMille stuff and things that I'm pointing to around that you just mentioned, Those were all done within a 2-year period.
Really?
Yeah. That whole stack over there. 2-year period, which looks like a body of work, but it really isn't compared to some of the photographers that have been going ever since.
Sure.
There are about 3 of us left. And, there's George Sherrill and a couple of other guys that are still sort of working. Most of them have said to heck with it and have gone off to Palm Springs if they're still alive. And Laszlo Willinger is still shooting now and again.
Yeah.
So, in that way, it makes me appreciate what I did that I didn't really appreciate at the time.
I suppose that's inevitable, though, don't you think? I mean, all of us in our creative work, you just take it for granted as part of your growth and your development. It's a job that you have to do. You do it, and you don't think of it as a place in history. It's like receiving letters from friends of yours who turned out to be very famous. But I never saved the letters. I would answer them, tear up the letter that I answered. That was done.
You don't know at the time.
Of course. I also think you have to have a certain kind of mind to think historically when you're 19.
Yeah. There's some people do it, but I didn't.
Yes,
I didn't do it. I could have had a complete record of everything I did and what everybody said and
what was Shirley Temple like? She's such a strange lady when you see her today.
Yeah. She was kind of quiet and unassuming, and then I was photographing her when I don't know how to say it. Anyway, she married a young actor about that.
John Agar.
About that period.